We created our own hook, but I'm not 100% happy with it yet. It works just fine here, but later in the course, when we update a place, we will actually load that data here from a backend. We will fetch the information about a place from the backend, which means it will not be there instantly when we render this component. It will take a short while. This here, of course, is available instantly, but let's also handle the case that this would take longer. You might think that later, when we reach out to a server, we use fetch or something like this, which returns a promise. And in the then block, we can then call useForm to initialize our form with the then fetched data. This is not allowed though. In React, there is a rule when it comes to hooks that they must only be used directly in your component function. So you must not use them inside of if blocks, inside of loops, or inside of other functions, including then blocks. So you would not be able to call useForm in a then block. And that makes sense because it would mean that you only set up your hook after the response is there and not when this component first renders. But of course here, during the first render cycle, we already need information from our hook from form state. So we need to call useForm early. Still, I want to update my form values at a later point of time once my response is there. And here to simulate this, let's just say that we get our identified place only after useForm is called. Of course, we could switch position here, but let's imagine that this is not possible because this takes longer to load. What can we do in that case? In that case, we probably want to initialize this with our invalid values here, so with empty values. And later, once we connect this to a backend, we will show a loading spinner whilst we're waiting for a place to load. So we will not show an empty invalid form, no worries. But here, let's just say we have some dummy initialization values. And then here, once we got our identified place, I want to update my form state. Now for that, we need to revisit our form hook and add some functionality that allows us to replace the values and the validities stored in the form. For that, I'll add a new function here, which I'll name setFormData. I will also wrap it with useCallback so that it is stored by React and not recreated unnecessarily. And then the actual function should take input data and form validity as inputs. And then here, I want to dispatch an action which I'll give a type of, let's say, setData. That's totally up to you, of course. You can use any identifier you want. And with that action, I want to pass my inputs data. So input data stored in the inputs key. And my form is valid data, which is that form validity we're getting. So this is an action we dispatch against our reducer now. setFormData is then also returned in this array, so that if we want it, we can get it. And then here in our reducer, we just have to handle that new case, that setData case we just added down there. Inside of setData, I want to return a new form state, which is basically overriding the existing state. Hence, I will also not copy the old state. I will just replace it entirely. And there, I will set inputs to action.inputs, because on my action here, I do have that inputs key. And we also have that form is valid key, and that will be used to set the overall validity of the form. Is valid is set to action, and then I had form is valid. So action form is valid. So now we can basically call this setFormData function, which we're exposing here, whenever we want to set a form data, so whenever we want to dispatch this action. useCallback also needs to specify its dependencies, and here we essentially got none. So this will never be recreated, this function. So we got that in place. With that, let's go back to update place and get access to setFormData here as well, which we can pull out of the returned data as a third element. Side note, in new place, I will not get it because there I never need to set any form data. I only need that in update place. So there, now, once we got our identified place, we want to call setFormData and basically initialize our form now. Set the overall validity to true, and here, set different values for title and description. Title will have a value of identified place title, and the validity is true therefore. And here I have identified place description and is valid is true here as well. Now calling it like this would be bad though. If we call it like this here directly in our component function, it means whenever this component re-renders, we set new form data. Whenever we set new form data, we in the end dispatch this action, and therefore we trigger our form reducer, and whenever that reducer runs, it produces a new state. And whenever it produces a new state, even if the state data hasn't changed, it still is technically a new state. So whenever it produces a new state, the component that uses our hook will re-render. So we would have an infinite loop here. To avoid that, we can use a good old friend, the useEffect hook. We can use useEffect from React and wrap our call to set form data in it. So here I have useEffect. And in this function here, in the useEffect function, I want to call set form data. Therefore, I have two dependencies here, set form data and identified place. Now, identified place, thankfully, will not change with every re-render cycle. That logic will run with every re-render cycle, but we will always find the exact same object, the same object in memory. So it will not change, and therefore useEffect should not trigger again. And set form data will also not change because in our hook, we wrapped it with use callback. With that, if we save this and we go to edit, you see this is empty now. You see this is empty and it also never changes. So something is not working as it should. Let's see what that is. So what's the problem here? The problem is that our hook and our set form data logic here will work fine, but we do have this initial value and initial valid prop on the input, right? Now what happens inside of our input component? These values are taken to initialize our input state there. So that means when the values assigned to these props change, nothing happens in our input component, because only when this is rendered for the first time, this initial state is taken into account, and thereafter it does not run again. So it doesn't reflect any changes to the initial values. So how can we work around this issue? In update place, we have to defer when we create our form, so that we only render the form and its inputs when we really got our data for that, when we really got our identified place data, and once we used that to update our form data, so that we don't create this form too early with the dummy fallback data we set up here. Later, once we connected React to our backend, this will be easier because then we will be sending a HTTP request anyways, and we will know once this request finished. Here, since we're still kind of working around a problem which we don't really have, I'll use a temporary workaround, which we will absolutely replace later. I will only return this form here if we do have a value for title, let's say, which is an indicator that the values have been loaded for title and description. So here I will check if form state inputs title value is a thing, and only if it is a thing, I will render this form here and then close the curly brace after the form. And I actually don't need curly braces for that because it's the start of the return statement anyways. So now the form is only rendered if we do have a title value. Or to make this a bit nicer from a code perspective, we could also say if we don't have this value, so if this is an empty string, which is the case in our initial fallback value, we instead return some dummy JSX where we maybe say loading. And again, we'll find a better loading solution later. But for the moment, this should do the trick. Here, I got one extra parentheses. Let's remove that. And with that, now, when I reload, we don't even see the loading state because, of course, everything loads instantly here because we're not really making a HTTP request. But we see we now got our correctly initialized form data. The problem we now have is, once I clear the input, though, it's gone and we see loading because in our logic, whenever we don't have a title value, we want to show loading. So it's maybe not the best fallback. We can use it at the moment though, because as I mentioned, we will replace it later once we have a real loading state we manage with the help of HTTP. As a temporary workaround to have a little bit of a better solution, we can introduce a new state here with useState and name this isLoading, set isLoading, useState. Initially we are not loading, let's say, or to be precise, initially we are loading here. And then in useEffect, once we also set our form data, of course we're not loading anymore. So here I will set isLoading to false. So initially we are loading, then I set it to false once we got our data. And down here we can check if we are loading. In this case, I want to show the loading fallback and show the form otherwise. Now this works as before, but now we can also clear it without removing everything. So this is our solution for now. It's just important to understand that because of the way the input works and the initial value and validity is really only used once, we have to ensure that we only render this once we got the final values for initial value and initial valid. And with that, we are rendering this update form just fine. We are able to submit it and have our data there. And we're therefore well prepared here to connect this to a backend later as well.